Welcome to the latest CTO Craft Bytes. Today, we're going to be looking at how to manage engineering teams. If this is your first time at CTO Craft Bytes, let me tell you a bit more about this group. CTO Craft is a mentoring and coaching community for technology leaders around the world, focusing on supporting technologists in their leadership growth. Community members are over 1,400, and CTO Craft provides them with one-to-one coaching, mentoring groups, a curated Slack community, and events like this one. Huge thanks to our headline partner, AWS, for helping to make these Bytes events possible. So emceeing this Byte session today is myself, Ezechi Britton, or Ez. I'm a founding member, principal, and CTO in residence at ImpactX Capital. I'm also the co-founder of Code Untapped, Digital Skills Accelerator. So we have a fantastic panel speaking to you today. I'm about to do a quick introduction to them. We have Sarah Hale. Sarah joined Unity as a Director of Engineering in March 2020, leading a globally distributed team of engineers. They're working on developing a set of analytical tooling to help developers and publishers of games to understand their players with the aim of helping them to create a better all-round gaming experience for gamers. Previously, Sarah was a Director of Engineering at Click Travel, a travel management company committed to improving the business travel experience remotely from Edinburgh. She was also Senior Engineering Manager at Skyscanner, I'm sure you've all heard of them, a travel search engine from Edinburgh. There she grew a multidisciplined and distributed team with engineering, internationalization, localization, and translation expertise. So she is a software engineer who's worked her way up from intern to principal to engineer and now Director of Engineering for a global organization such as Unity. Thank you, Sarah, for joining us today.
Hi.
Next, we have Sally Lait. She will be joining Farewill later this year. They aim to make everything to do with death simpler, faster, and fairer, and she'll be joining as the Head of Engineering in October. Most recently, she was the Engineering Director across operations at Monzo and leading the web as a discipline business-wide, supporting the company to reach its over 4.3 million customers. Before that, Sally ran a consultancy business, worked agency side, originally starting out as a developer and architect. And I believe you're involved in the ODI, the Open Data Institute, founded by Sir Tim Berners-Lee.
Yes, I have done some projects with them. They're lovely, lovely people. Hello,
Fantastic.
everybody.
And then last but not least, we have Pat. Pat is the former scale-up CTO at N26. He also runs the popular newsletter for leaders in tech, Level Up and the Tech Lead Academy. He's the author of 3 books, including Building Evolutionary Architectures, Talking with Tech Leads, and the Retrospective Handbook. He's worked for over 14 years at global consultancy ThoughtWorks as a principal and technical consultant. He's now focused on leveling up other technical leaders through training, one-to-one coaching, mentoring of director and VP engineers and CTOs of scale-ups. He's also currently offering a virtual training workshop built for fully online called Shortcut to Tech Leadership. So big congratulations to our fantastic panel and thank you for joining us today. So the topic that we're going to be speaking about is all about managing engineering teams. Now, this year has been one that has been absolutely paradigm shift in how we work as organizations, how we work as teams. And I know you all have experience in very different styles of running teams. Some of you are global, some of you are much more local. And this is all going to be about some of the key challenges that you faced whilst doing that. So let's start with the first key question. Engineering is core to all of your businesses. As I said, this year has caused a seismic shift in remote working. What have been some of the key challenges in managing your engineering teams during this transition? And Sarah, I'd be really interested in hearing from you on this one.
Cool. Yeah. So for me, there's been two key challenges. So one is making sure that we're able to communicate effectively whilst being distributed, and the second is making sure that, given that we're in the middle of a pandemic and we're having to work from home, is making sure that engineers have a place where they can successfully work from home, whilst being mindful of the fact that many people are probably going to be trying to homeschool or look after pets or people or all that kind of stuff, have lots of distractions. It's not your typical work from home. So on the first one about the communication, that's probably one of the key things to get right when trying to work from home or work in a distributed environment. So I'm quite fortunate in the fact that because we were office-based but had global distribution, we have some good practices to rely on in this situation. So my top sort of key things there is making sure you write things down. The asynchronous communication is super important, but even things like adopting week logs. So for example, all my teams, they write, what impact they've had this week, what risks are potentially coming up, and what are they planning to do next week in a week log. We combine that into an overall week log for the whole department. And actually every single part of the org does this. So you can get a really good bird's eye view of everything that's going on. And then you can drill down where it's appropriate. So writing is really important. Recording your Zoom sessions, and just trying to share that. The one thing that we brought to it to try and emulate a little bit more of, having those ad hoc chats that you might have in the office is coming up with virtual coffee breaks. So you in an office, you might all sort of gather around the coffee machine and have a chat about your weekend and all that kind of stuff. When you're working from home, it's a little bit harder to do that. So we've done that. We just recreated that via Zoom and encourage, people to build relationships which aren't just founded on work. So talking about, what you did at the weekend, what TV programs you're watching, and all that kind of stuff. But I think probably also, which is of equal importance, is that effective work from home spaces. So I'm really fortunate in the fact that we've got a work from home stipend that we can use. So I've been trying to encourage my engineers to actually use it. So it's money provided by the company to buy a chair or a desk or a monitor or something like that to try and make your environment better. There was an engineer who I had was just sitting, laptop on knees on a sofa and just trying to do your work, and you're like, short term that might be fine, but long term it's not going to be good for them. So it was about saying, we've got these things available to us, feel free to use them. So that was one thing. And then the other thing is around sort of, I guess, trying to make everyone feel like it's okay if you have, unexpected interruptions. So, rather than creating an environment where people are scared to have their child walk in and go, hello, I want a biscuit or things like that, just, celebrating the fact that, little life events happen and it's okay. So, yeah, those would be my main things there.
Fascinating. And obviously, your teams have already been remotely distributed anyway. So whilst there's been a big transition, it's something that I assume your organization has been fairly experienced in working with. But yep. Given that, Pat, I know obviously you were CTO at N26 for quite a few years, and you've transitioned to more of a coaching role. How have you dealt with your CTOs and your tech leaders who are having to deal with these kind of challenges?
Yeah, it's a great question because I guess I get to see a portfolio of different people in different situations. So, one of the CTOs that I'm working with, they're sort of working with a remote first company. So this hasn't really affected them too much, and that they've already got some good practices. Whereas other sort of companies that were sort of based in a single city have really had to go through their own personal journey of sort of understanding how to lead effectively, to get feedback and to get a temperature check of how their team is doing really remotely. And I think it's I think what I notice is that you can give people sort of ideas and tips, and Sarah's given us some really great examples of what could happen, and it's kind of also a sort of stylistic or a personal choice in terms of what a team will like to adopt or what a company will adopt as well. So some people are doing the sort of virtual coffee break type stuff that Sarah was mentioning, but for other teams it's been a little bit more about sort of trying to do sort of team gatherings remotely, right? So I know an organization that's sort of they have a team taster, right? So somebody might send out like a tea sample or something like that, and everyone is sort of enjoying that at the same time as a way of trying to really get some personal time together or team time together, even though everyone's remote.
And have you noticed any fatigue over the months as this has been happening? Because obviously all these kind of these team sessions, trying to bond with the teams remotely, how has that impacted over time? And I guess, Sally, I'd love to hear a little bit from you on that. What do you think there?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's not the same. Let's be honest. It's not the same in terms of having a tea time and scheduling that as, oh, do you fancy going down the pub for a quick drink? You know, I don't think that anybody's pretending it is. And so we've touched on it a little bit already, but I think for me, I kind of picture it in terms of a spectrum of the companies that were purely office-based, very sort of like traditional before, and then companies who were kind of entirely remote, globally distributed, and then everything in between. And different people are going to be shifting different amounts along that spectrum, I think. So there are tons of things, but I broadly tend to think about it in terms of the changes that you need to make to your practices and the changes that you need to support people through that. And so we talked, you know, Sarah gave some great examples of things like moving more to async and, you know, changing the way that you can actually communicate. But I think it's really important to actually be honest about the challenges that you're facing. So I'm going to be going through remote onboarding soon, and I'm looking forward to using that as an opportunity to see what we could do better. So even things you might have been fantastic at before, you might not be now. I do find it exhausting being on the screen all day as well. So I think there's a lot of things where it's a combination of that practice and then actually helping the people. But generally, as a leader, I try to model as much as I can. So I tend to be very open. I share quite a lot, very honestly. I try to make it explicit that interruptions are okay. So, you know, you talked about that, Pat, but one of my best memories from this, I think, will be playing Who's That Pokemon with my colleague Michael's daughters. And I saw it being described as you're being invited into somebody's home. And so I very much see it as that. But even down to things like modeling that it's okay not to wear makeup every day or whatever it might be. I think there are a lot of things that we can do to actually make people feel more comfortable whilst we're also changing those practices and accepting that everything isn't the way that it was before.
So given that, actually, Sally, that brings me on to my next question, which is, how have you all supported your teams with remote working, and what are your long-term plans regarding going back to the office? And this is really interesting with you, Sally, given you've just joined a new organization. So talk to me a little bit about what's going on there.
Yeah, and I think this is something that a lot of companies, so going through the interview process recently, it was one of the conversations that I had with everybody was, what were they doing before? What do they expect to do now? And a lot of companies just don't know. Everything is so in flux, and this is new to us all. So for me, I have worked either sort of like partly remotely or fully remotely for a number of years. And that was part of what I wanted to do anyway. So it was really important for me to find a great fit. So when it's safe to, I'm probably going to go back to going to the office 2 days a week. But, everything is in flux at the moment. So we're just going to have to go with the flow a little bit. But in terms of kind of how to support teams with it, I think we've mentioned a few things. But for me, there's a lot of great resources out there. A lot of people have been doing this for ages, and that, there are companies. So I think Automatic publishes a lot of their processes and how they do things. There's really great examples. So for me, I am mindful that I'm an individual. So my long-term plan was never to be in the office very much. But for other people, it is a huge challenge. So kind of meeting in the middle, doing some of these things that we've talked about. So making sure that the company can support for home equipment, contribute to people's bills, building it into actually the company strategy as much as helping people as individuals, I think is really, really important going forwards.
And so with that, Sarah, be really keen to get some of your insights around this, especially given you have a lot of experience working with remote teams already. Now, for those who are now thinking about going back to the office, what's your general direction and any advice that you have for other leaders who need to work in the same way?
Yeah, so I think it's similar to, I guess, what Sally was saying there, is that we have to recognize that everybody is an individual. So some people are really struggling with the idea of working from home and are desperate to get back to the office. And then there's others who didn't realize that they actually quite enjoy working from home, and actually it's allowed them to, do a better work-life balance because they don't have to commute or other things like that. And so there probably isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. So I've been quite impressed with how Unity's been trying to handle this, given the fact that because we're across like so many different countries, there's so many different regulations that we need to be taking mind of, never mind what we want to do for our individual teams. So we actually have a dedicated team who are working on our return to office plans, and it's different, it's going at different paces, and it's going and there's different stages for each office. But I really like the fact that the people who are running that have been asking the employees of each site, how comfortable do you feel? Do you want to go back when it's in code yellow stage 1, which is where you've got like a bunch of restrictions and guidelines to follow? Or do you want to wait until it's code green, where effectively we're saying it's back to normal? And there hasn't been that pressure. So being able to sort of, try and meet the needs of people who are desperate to get back and people who aren't desperate to get back is really challenging. But I think it's really important to just be open and listen, like actually listen to what people are saying, and then use them as your guide.
So I think the key thing there is that there's a spectrum, right? There's a spectrum of desire and expectation. I just want to quickly touch on this with Pat, because you work with a lot of different leaders, right? And a lot of CTOs, and some have a pressure to bring back their entire organization. Others are able to work along that spectrum. What are you seeing from that perspective?
So like this, and it comes down to people in leading, is that every company, every person is different. And a lot of this, I think, comes down to maybe the type of the business. So where there are some businesses where there's maybe more logistical or operational, so hardware or people involved, there's a need for a bit closer collaboration with that. And so some of the organizations will want to sort of go back to a little bit more of an in-office sort of space. Where the companies are sort of maybe pure digital, pure tech, they're probably a little bit more comfortable dealing with the normal sort of distributed remote. I think also one of the interesting challenges for this particular audience as well is dealing with sort of peers. So if you're like working as a CTO and you have a CEO who is adamant about working in person in office, that will determine a lot about what you will be able to do. And that's a big challenge that you're going to have to struggle with, because from a tech perspective, you're probably a lot more comfortable doing things distributed. But that's a very maybe uncomfortable world for a lot of sort of CEOs and particularly founders who are very much about that sort of in-person contact. So yeah, I think it really, I think the challenge for every leader is really trying to do what's safe for their people, to listen to what's going on, and also to balance out the needs of kind of your organization with what you can do for your team.
And with that, I think this brings us on to a really interesting question, which is hiring strategies, right? Mm-hmm. So Sarah, I'd love to know a little bit more about how remote working, I mean, you're already a distributed organization anyway, but how this is going to affect your hiring strategy going forwards. Will it enable you to hire people from further afield, for example? And how do you resolve that?
Yeah, so I think that's a really interesting point. And I guess it has affected my strategy and hasn't in some ways. So my teams currently are situated in Edinburgh, Austin, Montreal, and San Francisco. And so we've been looking about how do we, it's a lot of time zones. So it's like, how do we work effectively together, but without, accidentally creating horrible work schedules for people. And historically, it's been very much like, I'm based in the Edinburgh office, so I want to, help people relocate to Edinburgh if I'm hiring from further afield, so they're within commuting distance. But I think now I'm actually thinking, does that matter as much? Because effectively we were working it based on the fact that we were office-based, despite being, also distributed. Whereas now we're actually quite comfortable looking further afield, but being mindful of time zones, because that's hard, and also the ability for people to be able to come to an office for an offsite, when that's safe to do so again. So it's trying to get that balance correct. But I think, yeah, my big thing there is time zones. I know I've said it a few times, but it's really challenging to have teams that are sort of made up of lots of different time zones. So if you bound them, it makes it a lot easier. And that would be my sort of main change there. Yeah, and I think the other thing which I'm looking for as well is we were already sort of doing this when we were interviewing people, but is trying to make sure that we're trying to find out if people will be comfortable being more work from home or being distant rather than office based in terms of like their motivation, and are they going to thrive in that situation? Because what you don't want to do is hire somebody who secretly desperately wants to be office based, but happens to be in London, so they're not office based, and then that's not setting them up for success. So it's about trying to explore and find out all of those things, but whilst also being able to look for talent, wider than just that small little office-based system.
So I guess, and this is a question that's open to all three of you, and maybe Sarah, you're the best place to answer it currently, but one of the things I find really interesting about this environment is that potentially now, for those for whom remote working works, it does work, right? They don't have to be in the same location. For example, Nigeria is on the same time zone as London, right? Here's a great example. And there's a very well-educated populace out there, technically literate. What are the challenges to just saying, you know what, I can hire remotely, so why not, right? What are the blockers to that?
So in my experience, it's a lot of employment laws and the complexities of dealing with that. That seems to be the largest blocker. I know in my previous company, because we were UK based, I was restricted to hiring people across the UK. I could do anywhere in the UK, but doing further afield than that makes it really hard from like a company perspective for like tax and employment laws. And at Unity, we have offices dotted everywhere, so it's really easy for me to go, I want to hire in Vancouver or France, because we have offices there. But if I want to hire elsewhere from that, then it becomes a little bit more challenging, just because of the employment law and all that kind of stuff. There are websites, I can't actually remember the name of it, but I was watching with like Ernest, I think it was like remote.com. They're trying to like tackle that, so that smaller companies can actually start accessing great talent in areas that they might not have an actual entity. So I'm eagerly awaiting for things like that to take off.
And I just want to touch on a point that's been raised in the chat channel about remote, and it's something a friend of mine who's a CIO has mentioned before, which is that unless everyone works remotely, it can be very difficult to enable that level of flexibility. If you've got some people in the office, some people working remotely, how do you have a planning session with a dev team or a design session? And you've got some people on the whiteboard and some people on a laptop. How have you guys approached some of these challenges?
I'll jump in.
Go for it. Go for it. This one's open. Any one of you can answer this one.
So I think actually this situation has been kind of a great level in some ways, because it's forced everyone to have to deal with the challenges of like trying to get Zoom to work and trying to use online whiteboards and all that kind of stuff. So again, it helps build up that empathy that perhaps might have been missing if you were office-based, because you just don't necessarily realize that it's so much harder if you're the only person who's on the screen to be able to interrupt and go, I have a thought, unless you have a really good facilitator who happens to be on site. So I think in some ways this situation is helped create that level of empathy, but I would say it's really tricky. So what I try and do is avoid having a single person who is remote. So either try and make sure that everybody is remote, or like have an equal balance of people on site and off site.
Fantastic.
Maybe I'll jump in. One challenge furthering what Sarah was saying is I think for leaders, the hardest thing is capturing yourself and your habits. And this is one thing that I'm noticing with a lot of leaders, particularly if they're transitioning from sort of an in-office to a remote thing, is that, if they've got a couple of people that are now remote and a lot of people that were sort of centralized around a hub, even though everyone's working from home, there's sometimes that temptation to say, hey, like, the afternoon's okay, let's all meet up together. And then there's half the team that's been forgotten. Yep. And I think that's the hardest challenge, which is really being aware of your habits as well and what you're doing to either create a sort of uneven playing field, or asking yourself, am I actually thinking, is this fair for everyone? And is this a way that everyone in a team or in my department can actually work?
So this was a common issue actually for a lot of leaders, wasn't it? Let's go down to the pub and have a drink after work. But not everyone drinks. Not everyone wants to go to a pub, right? Some people have kids and they need to get home. How do you keep that team feel when you have particular habits that make sense for you? And this kind of leans into my next question around D&I strategies. So, Sally, I know obviously your time at Monzo and you're entering a new organisation now at Farewill. So you have an opportunity to put your stamp down. So I'm really interested to hear your thoughts around D&I strategy, and particularly given the impact that COVID-19 and the pandemic has had on people from underrepresented backgrounds as well. How has that helped shape your thoughts around the D&I strategy that you're going to implement at Farewill? And what lessons have you learned from your time at Monzo?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't want to talk too specifically about Farewill's strategy yet, but I do know for a fact that there is a huge amount of importance placed on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that is actually one of the reasons that I joined. And so in this sort of arena, I tend to think of D&I or D&I almost being sort of similar to accessibility when we're creating software, and bear with me on this. But by that, I mean that there's a lot of, there's multiple facets. So performance itself can be an aspect of accessibility. And it's exactly the same in terms of there are so many different intersectional issues. And so I think when it comes to COVID and when it comes to this topic more broadly, there is a balance between kind of addressing individual situations to make them more equitable and doing things that actually need to be addressed for everybody. And so part of what I want to do at Farewill, and I've already had some really great conversations with Tom, the CTO, about this, is for us to create an environment that allows anybody to join our engineering team and to feel like they can be successful. And by extension, we then want that to flow to the rest of the business. And to do that, you asked whether the current environment has an impact, and absolutely. We're going to need to support people differently, particularly at the moment. And this is where kind of the equity side comes in. So I think there are huge ways that COVID is affecting people. And that's everything from, mental health support might need to be greater. Right now, that's kind of a really obvious example. But I think it's really important to think about how people may have had coping mechanisms that they can't reach for anymore. People might have, spent those 2 weeks on the beach for mental or physical health, and they can't. Now, I think it came up, I can't remember who mentioned it, but now people are being pushed back to the office. We might unintentionally be pressuring people into feeling that they need to share personal details. Maybe they're immunocompromised, maybe they're pregnant, maybe there's other things going on. So we need to be really, really sensitive on what this might be actually kind of sort of making people feel like they have to disclose unintentionally. And I think there's a huge range of societal factors as well. So we've mentioned a couple of times now that not everybody has a good office space. It is actually quite costly for some people to work at home. I've been on calls where people have been sat on the floor of their bathroom to try and get some privacy. And then there are, there's facts like how women generally take on the burden of home tasks still. And so it's not the same for somebody to be working from home in normal times and somebody who's trying to maybe homeschool kids because they don't feel safe going back, make lunch, run the household. So we have to be really careful that COVID isn't unintentionally creating this, this new divide, which caters again to people's privilege. So I think we need to be really explicit about what has and hasn't changed and what we need to do better for this. So I think a lot of this, it kind of going back to what I was saying before about kind of changing processes and supporting people, a lot of it does very much relate to that. So thinking about your existing processes. I had, again, another really good chat with Tom the other day, talking about performance reviews within a pandemic. Yep. And at the best of times, you obviously want your processes to be safe and unbiased and productive conversations, helping people grow and helping the business. And I've seen some views that performance reviews shouldn't happen in this environment. And there's obviously a number of considerations, like what if people have been furloughed? Some were furloughed and some were not. What if some people have had time off for kids or anxiety or whatever it is? But also, if you pause things like this or, promotions cases, are you accidentally hindering people's careers? Are you not giving them that positive reinforcement they need or not helping them to set goals? So there's some really interesting conversations to be had. And I think there's another really good example in the chat of how catering for some people to be remote and not is really challenging. But actually, you can by thinking about your processes, I think you can improve the inclusion. So talking about things like pairing and collaborative work, Sophie Coonan, an amazing senior web engineer that I used to work with, recently did a talk, and in the QA it came up that using tools like Visual Studio Live Share, even if both people are office-based, can be more inclusive, because you're both working in the environment that suits you. You both got your key bindings, your keyboard, your themes even. So thinking about, again, like having these conversations about what can we do to generally be more inclusive for the long haul, I think is really important. But ultimately, it will obviously be up to the businesses to think about all the different multifaceted issues and to adapt their strategy accordingly.
Fantastic. That was a really, really good answer to that. And thank you, because it's such a challenging issue, particularly from, how does it impact your interview practices, for example, if you're interviewing a young person who's just out of university, still living with their parents, who maybe have 2 or 3 young children in the house, or maybe an uncle living with them who is an alcoholic, for example, and then impacts their ability to have a fair interview with you. And how do you manage and cope for these things whilst both reviewing people's work process and 360-degree reviews for them at the end of each year? How will we benchmark these individuals against their performance last year, for example? Yeah. So these kind of things, I think it's really important to be thinking about. But I think that leads into quite nicely the next thing, which is the impact that all the stuff you guys have been talking about around COVID-19, remote working, home working practices, not being in the office, not being able to meet your teams. These things have all had an impact on people's mental health, right? And this has had an impact on their health as well as yours as leaders, right? The pressure on you as leaders to try to treat people fairly and make strategic decisions has been huge. So, Pat, I'd love to know, given your role as a mentor and a leader, what you're suggesting and advising to the individuals and the leaders that you're coaching.
Yeah, it's a really stressful time for everyone. And the first bit of advice I work with a lot of people on is asking about, well, questions that we explore is, what is their self-care regime right now? So I'm a big believer that you can't lead effectively if you are under extreme amounts of stress. You naturally have stress as part of a leadership role, but if you don't have that sort of space to think through topics, to sort of manage your emotions so that you can really think through topics and how to respond effectively, you're not going to be able to do that effectively. And that's even more essential in this time here when there's just so much more stress. It's like emergency after emergency for a lot of sort of companies where COVID has negatively affected their businesses. But even for those businesses that have positively benefited from COVID, they're under a lot of stress because now they've got like massive growth and they've got like massive opportunities that they also have pressure from the business. And so that sort of stable heartbeat of, have you got your space to think through what are your priorities, how you have the most impact, what are the most pressing issues, how do you delegate things to sort of get more space to think more strategically? These are kind of that sort of first step to really managing through, all of this. Because then you can actually think through, okay, how do you support your team? How do you deal with the things that are most pressing for them? If you don't have the time to, talk to your team, you'll just end up reacting and you'll end up in a really negative loop of no time, more reaction. And so that's why the self-care and sort of trying to make sure that people have that thinking time is really essential. And like every leader, everyone is a little bit better or worse at this. So for those that are, we're never taught about effective time management or how to say no or how to delegate. These are things that I work with them through more. There are other leaders who are much further down that journey. But, I think understanding where people should be, of having enough space so that you can be the most effective leader that you can, is really a fundamental aspect in these particular times, especially.
I think I noticed an interesting comment in the chat around the difference between remote working and working from home. They are two different things, right? When you're working from home, you are remote working, but remote working doesn't necessarily mean working from home. Now, I know, Sally, you put a lot of thought into, the mental health well-being issues. So I'd love to know a little bit about some of the concrete pieces of advice you give to individuals in your teams around how to manage their mental health during this time.
Yeah, sure. And I think this is a topic that is really important to me. I think it's important both as an individual and as a leader. And so I have a very long, convoluted story that I won't go into. But this is kind of year 2 of lockdown for me. So I had to be tied to my home for months last year. And so actually, I kind of went through a lot of the things that people have been going through this year a little bit earlier, which is not great, but at least, gave me a bit of a heads up. And so everything Pat was saying about like checking in with yourself, I started to know this time around to recognize the signs of things that I knew were not great. And so in terms of kind of general culture, I generally try to build a culture of good safety and trust so that people can open up and they can talk. As I said, I'm very open. So I would share how I'm doing with my mental health. At Monzo a while back, I was on a panel about mental health, trying to kind of normalize these conversations and talk through. And I think that one of the most important things is that people are in a situation that I don't want to use the word unprecedented, but it is. And so people are experiencing something they have never experienced before. And so even people who may have thought that generally their mental health is good may not know the signs. So trying to get that information out there, trying to help people understand what is happening, to be very kind of challenging, but in a gentle way about things like time off and being visible as a person myself about booking a holiday, even if I'm just staying at home, having mental health days. These are things that I think people can just push through if they're not challenged to go, actually, how are you doing? And so I never like to dictate how anybody works because, people have different patterns of what works best for them. But I do ask a lot of questions as well. So I ask things like, it's a lovely day. Is there any reason why you can't finish up early today? And kind of prompt people a little bit in those ways, or ask them, when was the last time they did something nice for themselves? So trying to focus on and think about positives as well, and trying to get people to kind of like open up and think about what we can do to make it better for them. So lots of one-to-ones, lots of well-being check-ins, lots of kind of really open, honest conversations. I think it's really important. And then trying to, again, identify the practical things that we can do as a company to feed that back into the system and make it better generally for everybody as well.
Fantastic. So look, we've talked a lot about the challenges that have happened this year, right? But there have been some unexpected positives out of all of this as well. Sarah, talk to me about some of the good things that have come out of this environment, this situation, and this period of change that you've been through.
Yeah, so I think there's a few things which have been quite surprising. I think one is that some people really thought that there was no way they could possibly work from home, and they've surprised themselves in the fact that yes, it's different, but they have actually been successful at working from home, and I think that's sort of really helped gives a little bit of a morale boost. One of the other things is the fact that you can onboard people successfully remotely. I have been onboarded completely remotely. It is still a little bit strange that I've not met any of my colleagues in person yet, so I'm looking forward to doing that at one day. But the fact that you are it is possible to create an onboarding plan where you can get people integrated and contributing and up to speed just as successfully as you might have done even if they were in person. I think that's been really reassuring, but also quite fantastic. It does take a lot of effort, so concentrated effort. So thinking about more precisely about what are you going to do to help make sure they meet all the right people, they're involved in the right team meetings, they understand what's expected of them, and whilst also still balancing it with it is a weird time right now, so you can't expect them to suddenly be amazing from day one. So setting those realistic expectations. But yeah, I think that's been really great. And then the other one, I don't know whether it's more just been true for me and a few people I speak to, or whether it's been wider, but I have found that it's been easier to manage interruptions. So because you're not in the office and people don't just see you and go, oh, I'll just walk up and go, hello, I have a question. It's easier to you can mute Slack, you can mute email, you can sort of go, I'm going to put my heads down, headphones in, and actually just have half an hour, whatever, uninterrupted time, and manage that interruption flow. So it's not saying that you don't do that collaboration. I think it's really important to still seek that out, but I felt that you've got a little bit more control about when are you getting interrupted than perhaps you might do when you're actually office based. So those would be my things.
So with that, what about you, Sally? What about on your side?
I think a lot of the positives for me are around community, which sounds a bit sort of cliched, but how everybody has had to address this as a group. It's happening to everybody on the planet. And so, in terms of kind of my old team at Monzo, we bonded hugely over this year. And I think there were lots of different groups, but there's a group of female engineering managers, and we sort of had a lot of really great conversations. My team managers and ops and other people, there was still some great work being done. So a lot of that side meant a lot to me, and just the support that people got from each other. And then there were also sort of more niche, shall we say, community sort of things that people really threw them into. So there was an Animal Crossing Slack channel, which was the most wholesome place. And everybody just got so much solace from being a part of that. And I think that really genuinely helped people, particularly kind of in some of the tougher moments. So community was a big side. But then personally, I was talking about this the other day, and if there was not a global pandemic in place, there would be a lot to celebrate. So I decided to take voluntary redundancy. I'm very privileged in that I was able to do that and feel okay. I've had a ton of time off this summer. I'm not starting till October. I've got to do, 5 hours of Japanese lessons a week and go out adventuring and do online courses and stuff.
How's your Japanese now then?
Moderate as usual. But yeah, so just having that time and headspace, and actually to think about what's important to me and what I want to take into this new role, I think has been brilliant. And also, all the little things like not spending my life on a train has been great. So yes, new job, new things, lots of time to do things that mean things to me.
Absolutely. I mean, I can say for myself that in my organisations I'm involved in, there's been some great positives and a lot of flexibility and freedom to meet people that we potentially couldn't have done before this, and activities that we've been able to drive. Pat, from your side over at N26 and all the coaching work that you do, have you seen any great movements forward, any great positives that have come out of this environment?
Yeah, I think for a lot of leaders in particular, this is a unique opportunity, right? And for a lot of people who are sort of in the midst of all of this change, like they've grown a lot throughout this, right? And I think that's itself is a huge positive sort of experience for a lot of people. Is people thought I couldn't, I don't even know what working remote would be like, let alone managing a remote team. And then suddenly they have no choice, right? And it's kind of the same thing of when people have these different experiences they've never done before. It feels painful at first, but you adapt and you learn, and hopefully you improve. And through that improving, you're actually growing as well. And so, I think for a lot of people that I'm sort of working with, I'm really pleased to sort of see how they and how their team has been really, adapted to this environment and learned a lot through that process. And I think that itself is a really positive thing, because their business is benefiting from all the things they're actually doing to improve their teams and organizations, but also personally they're sort of growing and they feel a lot more capable, confident.
So sticking with you on that, Pat, I think one of the key things we look at is, what do engineering teams need from their leaders in a time of crisis and upheaval? We've spoken a lot about the challenges facing the individuals, and I think you're uniquely positioned to answer this question. What do you recommend? And this is the final question to the panel before we go to the Q&A, by the way. What do you believe your engineering teams, your CTOs, your CIOs, your leaders should be doing during this time period? What do you think the teams need from them?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I actually wrote a blog post at the beginning of the epidemic for this. I think there's a small formula that I like to recommend to people. It's called EAT. Not coping eating, but this is really about EAT in terms of empathizing, acknowledging, and then taking action. So, when there is so much of an emergency of a crisis, right, people are going to be really unsettled. And I think good leaders, they acknowledge the sort of temperature in the room or remote, and sort of say, hey, I know that you're feeling uncertain. And this is completely applicable, if your company is going through an acquisition or, they're going to have to lay people off. people get worried. And I think acknowledging the emotions is a really key part to understanding, getting people sort of prepared for understanding, what's the next sort of step. So you have to acknowledge these emotions. And then the second thing is really acknowledging or sort of stating your perspective of the facts. And this is the hard thing about emergencies and crises, is that, the situation changes constantly. We've seen this itself in terms of, do we have sorry, I've forgotten the word, a solution to COVID or not, right? Or not. And there's all these things that people hypothesize or not about. And I think it's your responsibility as a leader to sort of take stock of, here is what we know, here is what we are uncertain of, to try to make sure that everyone has the same sort of facts as much as possible, because this is one of the hard things, is that people make up stories in the absence of facts. So empathize, acknowledge, and then talk about what you're going to do, take action, right? So in a crisis, people want to have some certainty. They want to understand what is going to change, what is not going to change. And taking action may be as simple as saying, we don't know what we're doing right now, but the next week we're going to, take some time off and put together a plan. It may be as simple as that. If you already have a plan, it may be talking about, here is what that plan looks like, and trying to make sure that people understand what that is, but giving people assurance that, as leaders, you have a sort of responsibility to sort of create a little bit of certainty out of this uncertainty. So EAT is the nice little acronym, and I find it very helpful.
That's fantastic. And Sarah, I'd love to hear a little bit from you on this one.
Yeah, I think, I would just echo everything that Pat just said there. I think that's a great way to summarize it. I think one of the things that I've learned during this time is that because we are on Zoom quite a bit, I found that some of my usual measures to be able to spot if individuals were struggling or perhaps behaving differently from how they might have been in, less awful times was a bit harder to do over Zoom. So for there, it would be sort of echoing what I think we've said before, is asking those open-ended questions and not being afraid to be a bit vulnerable and be a bit authentic with how you might be feeling, to try and create that space where others feel okay to tell you that perhaps there's this unknown thing going on that you're not aware of, and perhaps we can help there. But it is more challenging via Zoom is what I found, but it's not impossible. Yeah.
Fantastic. And Sally, any last thoughts from you on that one?
Just that obviously you've noticed my cats have come in and shouted, which is just demonstrating the wonderful world of all of this. But no, I think Pat summarized it really, really fantastically. And I think that there are lots of opportunities out of this. It's a really, really tough time, both for individuals and for businesses. And I don't want to gloss over that at all. But I think that there are lots of things that we can do. And hopefully, if we can stay optimistic, this will set us up better, and it will force us to have a lot of conversations that are about really, really important topics. So I think there are lots of roles that we can all play in that. And I hope that we can make the industry a little bit better at the end of this.
Fantastic. Often what I like to say is, leaders need to be both empathetic and decisive. But if you need to choose one, choose decisive, right? And particularly in environments like that, I think that's really important. Okay, so we've got about 12 minutes left. I think it's time to take a look at some of the questions that the audience have been asking and voting on. Right at the top, we've got a question from Salim Siddiqui. And this really does chime in well with what we've been talking about here. He says, it's great that many of us in the tech sector have been able to transition into the new normal with manageable challenges because of pre-existing remote culture and infrastructure. This is not true for many of our neighbors, friends, and even family members, essential key workers, low-wage workers, etc. How concerned are you that the tech community will become even more insulated from the challenges and realities of the societies we live and do business in, widening of the digital divide? Now, before we answer that, I want to just touch on how we've seen the richest people in the world have all got richer during this pandemic, right? And those people are all leaders of tech organizations. So with that backdrop, and against the impact this pandemic has had on the lives of people, particularly from underrepresented backgrounds. I'm sorry to keep mentioning that. It's an important one to me, and I believe this panel.
Yeah.
How do you feel we get through this without widening that divide between us as technologists and technology companies and those people that we profess to serve? I'm opening this one up to the panel. Please go for it. All right, I'm going to pick someone. Pat, go for it.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think the way that I sort of think about it is, I ask myself, who is the tech community, and it's really about us and people. And I find it's helpful to sort of frame things not as an abstract entity, but actually to put myself or yourself into that sort of role. And the question is, what are we doing, to either broaden that gap or make a big difference? And I think this is a sort of an interesting thing because it comes down to personal responsibility. Of when you say it's a community's responsibility to take care of something, you're kind of also pushing responsibility away from you. And so I think that's an interesting perspective because it helps you sort of think about what am I doing to actually make an impact on this, right? And in terms of sort of trying to, what I see positive trends of doing is, when people are sharing practices, and I think that's been one of the really great things about, what I try to do about writing, but also what other people do is you're sharing information that hopefully other people can benefit from, right? Other people spend their time, actually working, training, sharing, and sort of giving people these sorts of skills. Other people do advocacy in government around education about trying to build in more digital sort of skills and things like that. So I'm kind of hopeful that there are more people, and I think this comes back down to all of you in the sort of, well, not just the panel, but all the sort of participants as well, around what are you doing also to sort of help your sort of communities around you learn a lot more, right? I think one of the things that I'm always very conscious of is sort of the sort of privileges that I have, and that helps me frame, how do I help other people who have different sort of circumstances than I have.
I think, Sally, I'd love to get your thoughts on this because obviously you've gone from an organization that was all about enabling financial freedoms, right? Through, removing breaking that monopoly that the big banks had. And now you've gone to an organization that's all around trying to help people in the last stages of their lives, right? So I'd just like to get your thoughts around this widening of the digital divide and where do you sit in terms of your concerns around what you're seeing happening?
Hugely concerned.
Please, elaborate.
Yeah. So I think in terms of, I know, I'm very clear about kind of my personal feelings are, as you will hear, of a very specific kind of type. So it motivates me to work on problems to help people. I never joined Monzo because it was a bank. It was about the culture. It was about the mission of making money work for everyone. And similar, I never thought that I'd be working in the death industry, but here we are. So I'm very motivated as an individual to try and create products and to do things that generally leaves the world in a better place than when I started. So I think that my personal choices are very much kind of along those lines of trying to do what I can. I also echo, putting things out into the world that help. I've been spending a bit of my time, sort of this holiday time off, whatever it is, doing things like I offered some free coaching sessions to people from groups that are underrepresented. So I think there's little things that we can all do as an individual. But then on the other side of things, as you've mentioned, the richest people in the world have got richer. I'm not going to change that. But I think that there are some huge societal questions that we as an industry can prompt if we work together. And so I think it's very much about using your voice as an individual to try and work towards larger outcomes where you can. And I'm also a big believer that people who are most affected by things shouldn't be the ones that have to fix it. So if you've got discrimination in your company, it's not on that person that's being discriminated against to fix the problems. And similarly, we've seen with Black Lives Matters and other, we're going a bit off topic now, but let's fix all the wrongs. We can do so much as an industry, and it should be the ones with the most privilege that lend that to others to try and help solve these things. So like I say, I'm very much, leaning in a certain way on this conversation, and I know that others might have other opinions, but I think for me, it's important to do what I can as a person, but also to help the industry make some strides as well, if possible.
Okay, fantastic. With that, I think I'm going to move on to the next question, and I'm going to target this one at Sarah, if you don't mind. What advice do you have for onboarding new starters when everyone is remote?
Yeah, that's a really good one. So I guess I was a little bit apprehensive about onboarding remotely. I wondered whether it would mean that I would be a bit lost or disorientated or not really sure what I'm supposed to be doing. But things that have helped is having a structured onboarding sort of process. So on the first day, I got an email telling me, your IT onboarding session is here and your HR one is here. You're going to meet your manager here and you're going to meet your team here. And it was very, very structured. So it was really busy, but it was really clear about like day one expectations are literally get your computer set up, learn about some HR policies and meet the team and nothing else. And then I worked with my manager in terms of, okay, so what's going to be my sort of plan for the next 30, 60, 90 days. And that's the same process that we're sort of trying to flow for everybody who's starting, whether it's intern to whatever level. I actually hosted an onboarding roundtable last week, which was really interesting to see. So basically, a batch of new starters, they'd been in the company for about 4 to 5 weeks. They were all sort of bundled together, and then I facilitated a roundtable with them to find out what was their onboarding like, what could we do to improve it, what things worked really well and what things didn't work really well. And it was really like awesome to be able to hear perspectives from people outside of the engineering department across all different sites. And I think that's one of the benefits. It wasn't just people who had onboarded in the UK recently. It was all over, again, grouped by time zones. But it was great to hear about their experiences at the different sites and in the different teams, and then swap ideas so that we could do that across each other. So yeah, I think it takes a little bit more organization. Being mindful of Zoom fatigue, that's another sort of big one because you are doing everything online, but just being really clear with the plan and setting up ways for people to connect with each other. So it helps foster some of those relationships and go-to people.
Thank you. With that, I think the next key question here, and we've kind of touched on it, but I'd like to see if there's any final thoughts on this, is what would you say, and this is from Martin, what would you say is the key difference in managing people remotely versus managing people on site? Pat, let's go to you on this one.
So my default answer here would be being aware of your own sort of biases or your tendencies. So, if you're a habitual person that likes to sort of meet people in person, you'll have certain tendencies to go that way. Whereas, if you're sort of more asynchronous by nature, you might be more tending to write things down. And so I think that self-awareness thing is very key in order to be aware of how maybe you don't quite treat everyone equally as a result. And so, I think that is kind of one of the first things. And then once again, looking at your habits of, if you're transitioning to a remote sort of workforce, look at, what you're doing intentionally to really think about remote first rather than, oh, I now just suddenly have a team that's remote, right? So it means you have to really rethink about your habits and your practices that you draw upon as your sort of standard toolkit, and you kind of have to reset them.
Can I ask you a question about that? Are you seeing many of the companies in your portfolio, leaders that you work with? I know you mentioned one, but how many of the others are considering moving fully to remote first models? Are any of them?
So I've only had 2 people that have decided as a company that they'll go remote first. It's still very early days, so it might backtrack. But I think given the hiring, giving onboarding in the current situation, I think they're a little bit more willing to sort of go first. They're also digital companies. So the other ones who haven't, I think they're a lot more tied to sort of either national or like operational kind of reasons. So that's one of the reasons I haven't gone fully remote yet.
Okay, fantastic. I think with that, we only have 1 minute left. I think it's safe to say we're out of time. It's been absolutely fantastic. And I just want to say a big thank you to Pat, Sally, and Sarah for talking with us today. To the audience, you can connect with our speakers after this event on the links that I've shared in the chat. And, you know, normally, if this was an in-person event, I'd get everyone to give a round of applause to our fantastic speakers, fantastic panel. Afraid we can't do that today, but, you know, I'm giving it. Well done, you've been amazing, and thank you for the great questions and the interaction from the audience. Sorry if we couldn't answer everyone's questions, but I think we can all agree this has been a really insightful and fantastic panel to listen to. Thank you very much.
Awesome.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.